Hey guys, welcome back to a new video. In this video we are going to set up our repository. So as you probably know if you're watching this series, in the repository we just have all of our data sources coming together. So on the one hand our local data source or room database, and on the other hand our remote data source, in this case our Pixabay API. But if you have seen the video about how to write good tests, and hopefully you have because that is super important, that video, then you know that one factor of good tests was speed. And network calls are everything but fast. So we actually don't want to make actual network calls in our test cases. Instead, we need to think of another solution for that. And that is where so-called test doubles come into play. So test double is basically just another version of a class, so in our case our repository, that is created for testing. So that is just very well suited for test cases. And that means we will have two repositories here in our project. On the one hand, our real repository, which will just get the data from our room database and also make the actual API call. So we will just use that repository in our real app, of course, because we need the data from the API there. But on the other hand, in our test directory, in our test source set, we will have a different version of that repository. But let's actually first start to implement our real repository here, and the rest will get clear when we get to that point. For that, we actually first need to include a so-called resource class. I think you probably know that if you're watching this series here. That is just a class that you can use in every of your projects that is perfectly suited for error handling, loading handling, and success state handling. So for that, I will go inside of our other package, create a new Kotlin file or class, just a plain Kotlin file called resource. And here I will just paste some code I copied from my project. As usual, you can get this code from the link to my GitHub in this video's description. And sorry, usually I'm not a fan of copy and pasting in tutorials, but this series should really focus on testing and not on any best practice styles in MVVM or architecture stuff, because for that I really have my other playlists you can watch for that, and you should really watch them before watching this series. Anyways, if you still don't know what this class does, it's basically just a generic class here. You can see that takes a generic parameter t, and in the constructor it has a status, a data parameter, and a message parameter. And we have an enum class as well here that can either be a success, error, or loading status. And we can just use this class to wrap it around any kind of object here, and then easily check if an error occurred, if the object is currently in the loading status, if it was successful. And then we can just later on really well observe on those statuses basically, and also get the data of that object from this data parameter here. Alright, so let's actually create our real repository here inside of a new package. So create a new package here in our root package called repositories. And in here we are going to create a new Kotlin file class, select class here, and call that default shopping repository. Then press enter here, and we will inject the constructor with dagger hilt. So add inject, import that constructor, and in here we will have a private val for our shopping DAO, which is of type shopping DAO, of course, and also private val for our shopping, or actually it's called Pixabay API, of type Pixabay API. Okay, so far so good, but if we now would just implement these normal functions here in our repository, for example to search for something in our API, then that would be a pretty bad practice, because as I said, we will have a test double, so a second implementation of the same repository, and that will also implement the same functions we have in this repository. So what we will instead do is we will define an interface in which we define the functions our repository should have, and then we let all of our repositories, so on the one hand this default shopping repository, and on the other hand the repository we will create for testing, both of these will simply implement that interface. So I will go to our repositories package here and create a new Kotlin file class called shopping repository, and that will now be an interface. And inside of this interface we will now define the functions our repositories should have. So on the one hand, that will be a function to insert a shopping item into our database. So suspend function insert shopping item, which takes that shopping item as a parameter. And we will have a function to delete a shopping item. So also suspend function delete shopping item and pass the shopping item we want to delete here. Then we will have a function to observe all shopping items, which will return a live data of type list of shopping item. We will have a function to observe the total price, which will also return a live data, but this time of type float. And finally, for our API, we will have a suspend function search for image, which will take the image query as a parameter, which is a string, so basically the search string, and that will return a response of type image response. So that is now our interface shopping repository, and then we can simply implement that interface in our default shopping repository and also in our repository that we create for testing, and both these repositories will then always implement the same functions. So we can go back to our default shopping repository here, implement that interface here, so shopping repository, and then we can simply press Ctrl-I to implement all those functions, press enter here, and there we go. So remove all those to-do statements. Most of these functions will actually be pretty empty, actually only a single line. So in insert shopping item, we will use our shopping DAO dot insert shopping item and pass the shopping item we pass as a parameter. And then we will also have a function here to delete an item. So shopping DAO dot delete shopping item, pass this item again. Here we will return shopping DAO dot observe all shopping items. Here we will return shopping DAO dot observe total price. And in our search for image function, we want to write a little bit more because we want to do some error handling here. And by the way, this must not be response here, this must be resource. So the class we actually pasted before, so we will actually do some error handling in this search for image function, and then depending on if we have an error, if that was successful, we will return a different type of resource here. If we change that here, we of course also need to change that in our shopping repository interface. So just change this to resource here. And then we can go back in here. So in here, we will simply return try. And in the try block, or actually let's write the catch block first. So we catch an exception. And in case we catch an exception, we simply want to return resource.error with the message couldn't reach the server. Check your internet connection, and we don't have any data we can attach to that, so we simply pass null for the data. Okay, and then for our try block here, in this one we actually want to make the actual request to our Pixabay API. So val response is equal to Pixabay API dot search for image, and we pass our image query. And then we can check if that response was successful. If it was, we want to check if response actually has a body. So response.body (let). So we make a null check here. If that is not equal to null, that means everything was successful. Then we can simply write return at let resource.success here, and we simply pass it for the data of our success resource. So later on we can then extract that image response here out of that success resource. And if that was null, then we simply want to return resource.error. And in that case, we didn't know which error occurred, so we just write an unknown error occurred. And we don't attach any data. And then in case the response was not successful, so in the else block, We also simply want to return an error resource with an unknown error occurred. And also don't pass anything for the data. And now it's actually time to create our test double for that repository. So let's move to our test source set here, not Android test. We will do that in the test source set because our view model doesn't actually require any Android components or something like that. So we can simply do it in this folder. And in our root folder here, we will create a new package called repositories. And as I said in the last video or the second class, we should always have the same package structure as we have in our main package here. So that's why I name this package exactly the same as this package. And in here, we will right click and create a new Kotlin file or class. Select class here, and that will be called fake shopping repository. So when it comes to test doubles, then there are actually several types of those test doubles. Very popular are so-called fakes and mocks. So in this case, we have a fake test double, and a fake test double is basically just a version of a class that is very well suited for test cases, but not very well suited for production. And that is exactly what we want to have here. So we want to actually test our repository in our API, but we don't want to make the actual network requests, which would be suited badly for test cases. So in the end, what we will do here is we will just have a simple list that simulates our actual database. And we will have a function in which we can just set a Boolean if we want to return an error from the API or not. So we can actually set up our repository as we want and then check if it actually does what it should do. And if this confuses you, remember, we don't write this fake shopping repository class here to test our actual repository. Instead, we write it to test our view model later on. So actually, we only need a repository that we can pass to our view model constructor in our test cases. And since we don't want to create such a default shopping repository in our test cases, we need to create a fake version of that basically just simulates the behavior of our real repository, but not in the same way as our real repository. So as I said, we will just have a simple list as database, and that is fine if we use that for a single test case only and then recreate that repository, because it doesn't matter for us if we use a list for the database or a real database, because the behavior of both are the same if we use them for a single test case only. So inside of this fake shopping repository, we will actually first have a list of shopping items. So that is called shopping items, and that can actually be a private val here. And we're going to set that to a mutable list of shopping item. Then we will also have a private val observable shopping items. So that is actually a live data object to simulate the behavior of this function, because that will also return a live data object, as you can see. So observable shopping items is equal to a mutable live data of type lists of type shopping item. And we can initialize this with our shopping items list. And we will also have such a live data object for our total price. So private val observable total price is equal to mutable live data of float, and call the constructor on that. And then a variable we will also have in this class will be a private var should return network error, and we set that to false. So as I said, we can set this variable from the outside later on to determine if our function should return an error or not. So if our view model is behaving as it should when there is no network error, and as well if it is behaving as it should if there is a network error. So we simply create a function here for that to set that variable. So function set should return network error, and in this function we simply set should return network error to the value we passed here, actually like this. Okay, now the next step is to actually let this class, our fake shopping repository, also inherit from the same interface we declared here. So that is actually the reason why we implemented that interface here. So we can let both our default shopping repository and our fake shopping repository implement that. So both actually have the same functions. So we simply implement shopping repository here, and down here we press Ctrl I and implement all of those functions that we need to implement here. We can remove the to-do statements and actually also make a little space here like this. So first of all, the easiest functions here are actually observe all shopping items and observe total price, because in here we will simply return our live data that we declare globally. So return observable total price, and in this we simply return observable shopping items. Then in our insert shopping item and delete shopping item function, we simply want to use our list of shopping items and simply add the item. So as I said, this shopping items list simply behaves the exact same way as our room database in our real repository, just that it does not save the items in a persistent storage, of course, but for our single test cases that is perfectly fine and much faster than saving that in a real database. But to correctly simulate the behavior of our live data objects here of observable shopping items and observable total price, we also should post the new value after adding an item to our list. So I will actually create a function for that to refresh the live data basically. So that can actually be a private function, refresh shopping items, or actually refresh, let's call it refresh live data. And in here we will use our observable shopping items and post the value of our current shopping items. So if we added a new shopping item, then this will be included in the shopping items list. Afterwards, we call refresh live data and we actually post the value of that shopping items with the new item in it. And our observable total price, we will also use that to post the value we can simply get from a function that I will also create here, which will be called get total price. So let's actually write that right now. Private function get total price, and that will return a float, so the total price. And in here we will simply return shopping items dot sum by double. Sadly, there is only a function to sum by double and not sum by float, so we need to convert that here, but that is not really a problem. So actually you want to sum by it dot price dot to double, and then we also need to convert that whole thing to a float again, so dot to float, and that will simply calculate the sum of all of our prices and return that in this function. And if we post that value, then we will simply just post the most up-to-date price value. So now we can use that refresh live data function in this insert shopping item function and call that. And we will do it the same way in our delete shopping item function. So shopping items dot remove shopping item. And we also call refresh live data. And now there's only one function missing here in this fake shopping repository, and that is our search for image function, in which we simply want to simulate returning a success and an error resource. So we simply return if should return network error. So if we want to return an error here, then we will return resource.error with the message error. That doesn't even matter here, because the message could be anything here. We just want to make sure that we emit such an error resource in case we should do that. And we pass null for the data. And else, we simply return a resource.success with an image response. So we can simply create an empty image response here. So that will take a list of image results. So we can just pass an empty list here, set total to 0 and total hits to 0 as well. And that is now it for our fake shopping repository class. Let's actually go through that again as a little recap, because that can be quite confusing in the beginning if you've never seen that before. So as I said, again, We only created this class to later test our view model, which we'll do in the next video. Because our view model will take a repository as a parameter, and then we can simply make that repository in the view model's constructor of type shopping repository, so of the type of our interface here. So we can both pass our default shopping repository for that and also our fake shopping repository. So that is why we made that interface actually. And in our fake shopping repository, we just simulate the behavior of our real repository, just to be able to check if our view model is properly responding to the events that come from the repository. So again, we also don't test anything with our API here in this fake shopping repository. There are actually ways to test APIs, but I'm not sure yet if I really want to include that in this playlist here, because then it will quickly become very complex. But maybe I'll do it, I'll think about it. You can write me in the comments if you really like that, then I will take a look at it, because I haven't learned that by myself so far, but I could take a look in it and then show that as well if you really like it. So I really hope everything was understandable here for you. If not, then don't mind to put a comment under this video and I can try to help you out with your questions. Have a really nice day. See you in the next video. Bye bye.